My friends, as your pastor, television preacher, and businessman Joel Osteen, I see so many people walking around today with a sense of bewilderment. They look at the news, they scroll through their phones, and they see what appears to be complete chaos. Random stories, disconnected events, things that seem impossible to follow, let alone truly understand. And I truly get it. It feels overwhelming. It feels like the world has lost its way, and sometimes it seems like nothing makes sense anymore. But here's what I want you to consider today to lift your spirit and give you a fresh perspective. What if it isn't random at all? What if there's actually a deeper thread, a quiet current, running through nearly every major story you've seen over the last decade or so? And what if understanding that thread can help us understand why our institutions sometimes feel strained, why the same names keep appearing, and why the playing field never seems truly level for everyone? What if the real challenge we're witnessing isn't just about politics, but about something far more fundamental? It's about who gets to define what's true, who gets to shape the reality you perceive, the information you trust, and ultimately the decisions you make for your life. Today, we're going to gain a fresh perspective on how reality is often shaped, one carefully crafted narrative at a time. And once you truly see it, I believe you'll realize it's been sitting right there in front of us all along. We just weren't looking at it with the right discernment. So let me start at the beginning. Let me take you back to when this whole thing really started to shift. Because understanding where we are now means understanding how we got here. And it all comes down to one simple, profound realization that changed everything. The understanding that perception can influence outcomes far more powerfully than evidence alone ever could. Think about that for a moment. Evidence is often objective, it's concrete, it's something you can measure and verify. But perception, my friend, perception is malleable. It can be shaped, it can be directed, it can be amplified. And somewhere along the way, certain leaders, certain organizations, certain power structures began to grasp this profound truth. They realized that if you could influence how people perceived reality, you didn't necessarily need to control reality itself. Now, this wasn't always intended to be malicious at first. Intelligence agencies learned it during challenging times. Public relations firms learned it while promoting products. Media organizations learned it while vying for attention. But gradually, quietly, these techniques began to merge. Stories weren't just being reported anymore. They were being carefully crafted, shaped, and engineered to create specific emotional responses, to gently guide public opinion in particular directions. And here's where it truly gets interesting. Phrases like protecting democracy became incredibly powerful in modern discourse. It sounds noble, doesn't it? Who could possibly argue with protecting democracy? But that phrase, sometimes subtly, became something else entirely. It became a cover for manipulating democracy. It became the justification for actions that would have been unimaginable just a generation ago. Now, I want to be clear about something. This wasn't necessarily about traditional lies in the beginning. It was far more sophisticated than that. It was about control. And control, my friend, is much harder to detect than simple deception. A lie can be exposed, but control often operates in the background, shaping the boundaries of acceptable thought without you even realizing it's happening. So how did we arrive at a place where this became possible? Well, part of the answer lies in understanding something we've all experienced: the difference between how someone sounds and what they actually do. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine two people standing in front of you. The first speaks beautifully, eloquently, polished, with every word carefully chosen. They smile warmly. They use all the right phrases. They sound professional, trustworthy, perhaps even presidential. The second person is rough around the edges. They're blunt. They say things that might make you wince sometimes. They don't always follow the script. They interrupt the flow. Now here's the question. Which one would you intuitively trust more? For years, we were conditioned to trust the polished one. Civility became a powerful measure of character. If someone spoke well, dressed well, behaved according to established norms, we often assumed they were acting in our best interests. But what if I told you that polish can become a kind of camouflage? What if charm and eloquence started being used as substitutes for actual accountability? Think about it this way. If I wanted to mislead you, what's more effective? Being obviously dishonest, or wrapping my message in beautiful language that makes you feel good even while I'm subtly guiding you astray? The professional political class, and even some in business, learn this lesson very well. They learned that actions that might be considered detrimental when hidden behind polite language are far harder to address than obvious corruption. Meanwhile, the rough, blunt outsider, who simply says what they mean, who doesn't play by those polished rules, can often become the villain in the narrative. Not necessarily because they're less honest, but because they threaten the established way of doing things. They refuse to participate in the performance. And that's what so much of modern public life has become, a performance. It's theater designed to convince you that the system works, that your voice matters, that the people in charge truly have your best interests at heart. But here's what changed everything. And this is where it all takes a crucial turn. The old megaphones started losing their exclusive power. For decades, the pathway to public opinion was controlled by a handful of gatekeepers: major newspapers, television networks, established magazines. If you wanted to reach millions of people with your message, you had to go through them. And they largely decided what was newsworthy, what was credible, what deserved attention, and what deserved to be ignored. That gave them extraordinary power, not just to inform, but to shape perceptions, to decide which stories lived and which stories faded, to determine what questions got asked and what questions never even entered the conversation. But something remarkable happened over the past 10 to 15 years. That monopoly began to loosen its grip. Not completely, not overnight, but steadily, undeniably, independent voices began to emerge. Podcasts reached millions without needing network approval. Citizen journalists started breaking stories the establishment media might have overlooked. Alternative platforms gave people access to information and perspectives that would have been virtually invisible just a decade earlier. This shift created a challenge for those accustomed to control, and I mean truly, deeply challenged them, because narrative control was one of their most powerful forms of influence. They couldn't always compete on policy outcomes anymore. They couldn't always point to improving conditions for ordinary people, but they could control the story. They could decide what you saw, what you might fear, what you believed. Except now, they couldn't. Not completely. The microphone had been pulled from their exclusive hands and given to anyone with an internet connection and something to say. So what did they do? They didn't simply accept defeat. They reinvented the game. If they couldn't control every voice, they would work to discredit the voices they couldn't control. They would label alternative perspectives as misinformation. They would pressure platforms to moderate content. They would coordinate behind the scenes to ensure their version of events remained dominant, even if they no longer had a complete monopoly. And this brings us to one of the most troubling patterns of the last several years: the emergence of what feels like two separate approaches to how rules are applied. I want you to really think about this, because it's crucial to understanding why so many people feel that fairness is sometimes lacking. Look at how justice or consequences sometimes seems to be applied in our society today. Look at who faces repercussions and who doesn't. Look at which actions get challenged and which ones get excused, explained away, or simply ignored. You can see it over and over again. Sometimes people in certain circles commit acts that would be devastating for others, but they are seemingly forgiven. Minor infractions by others can become major situations. The same behavior can draw completely different consequences depending solely on who commits it. Consider, for example, situations involving confidential documents in a private residence. For some, it becomes a career-ending scandal. For others, it might be framed as a misunderstanding, refusing to cooperate with certain official inquiries. Some face severe penalties. Others face no penalty whatsoever. Meetings with foreign officials. Some are evidence of grave concern. Others are routine diplomacy. Do you see the pattern? It's not always about the action. It's about the actor. And this does something profound to a society. It erodes trust, not just trust in specific individuals or agencies, but trust in the fundamental fairness of the system itself. If the rules don't seem to apply equally, if accountability appears to depend on alignment rather than actual facts, then the social contract begins to fray. People start to believe that the whole system is perhaps not what it appears, that there's no point in following the rules because the rules only bind certain people. They begin to believe that power protects power, and everyone else is just playing a game where the rules are constantly shifting. And when fairness feels absent domestically, something even more challenging happens internationally. The sense of reliability can diminish. Let me explain what I mean by that. Think about countries that have managed to stay secure despite being relatively small, or surrounded by potential threats. Switzerland, Finland, for most of its modern history, Singapore. What do they have in common? They maintain a credible presence. They invest in their defense. They make it clear that aggression against them would be costly. They don't rely solely on goodwill or moral posturing. They rely on strength and readiness, a clear understanding of their boundaries. Now think about America over roughly the past 15 years or so. What signals have we sometimes sent? We've at times projected confusion. We've sometimes seemed to apologize for our strength. We've pursued diplomacy that assumed our rivals just needed to be understood better, that if we showed them we meant well, they'd reciprocate. But here's a hard truth. Peace isn't maintained solely by good intentions. It's maintained by credibility, by making it clear that aggression will be met with consequences, that commitments will be honored, that threats will be taken seriously. When you project weakness, when you signal that you might not defend your interests, when you treat international relations like a campus debate about moral values, you can, unfortunately, invite chaos. Rivals might stop believing you'll act. Allies might stop trusting you will protect them. The whole structure of deterrence, of stable relationships, can begin to collapse. And what do you get? You get adversaries testing boundaries. You get invasions. You get hostage-taking. You get a world that's measurably more dangerous because the perceived cost of aggression has dropped. But instead of learning this lesson, instead of rebuilding credibility, our leaders sometimes seem to double down on the illusion. They kept insisting that the right words, the right diplomatic gestures, the right international agreements would solve everything. They kept believing that projecting moral superiority was more important than projecting clear strength. And all the while, they wrapped this approach in one of the most powerful phrases in modern politics: defending democracy. Now, I need you to really hear what Joel Osteen is about to say, because this is where hidden truth becomes impossible to ignore. Defending democracy sounds noble. It sounds like something every decent person should support. But watch what actually happens when those words get used. Censorship sometimes gets justified as defending democracy. After all, if someone's spreading misinformation, they're threatening the integrity of elections, right? So it's okay to silence them. Surveillance can become necessary to defend democracy. We need to know what the perceived enemies of democracy are planning. Selective prosecution can be justified as defending democracy. Those people weren't just breaking the law, they were threatening the foundations of our system. Do you see what's happening? The phrase has been turned into a shield, a justification, a way to shut down debate and challenge opposition while claiming the moral high ground. And the more control certain individuals or groups feel they need to maintain power, the more they invoke democracy to justify it. It's a masterpiece of subtle manipulation, really. Use the language of freedom to justify restriction. Use the language of fairness to justify bias. Use the language of protection to justify actions that might otherwise seem aggressive. And this is where political strategy, information control, and media coordination all come together under one unifying purpose: to secure a permanent advantage. Think about what happens when a political party realizes it can reshape congressional districts to guarantee outcomes regardless of what voters actually want, or when it can coordinate with certain media organizations to ensure only favorable coverage reaches the public, or when it can pressure social media platforms to suppress stories that might hurt their candidates. These aren't hypothetical scenarios. These are documented patterns we've watched unfold, and the stated justification is always the same. We're protecting democracy from those who would destroy it. But ask yourself this: if democracy needs this much control, this much careful management to survive, is it actually democracy anymore? Or has it become something else entirely? Something that uses the language of democracy while functioning more like an oligarchy, where a small group of connected insiders decides what's acceptable, what's true, and who deserves power. Now, I know this might sound concerning. It might sound like I'm painting a picture of some vast conspiracy, but that's not quite right. Conspiracies require secret coordination. What we're dealing with is something more subtle and more pervasive. It's a shared set of incentives and assumptions that align behavior without anyone needing to give explicit orders. Think of it this way: if you're a journalist working for a major outlet and you know that certain stories will get you promoted while others will get you marginalized, what do? You don't need your editor to tell you explicitly what not to cover. You learn the boundaries through observation. You internalize them. If you're a bureaucrat in a federal agency and you see that investigating certain people advances your career while investigating others ends it, you don't need a memo explaining the rules. You figure it out. If you're a tech executive deciding which content to highlight or suppress, and you know that going along with pressure from one political side brings good press and regulatory favors, while resisting brings scrutiny and threats, you make the obvious calculation. This is how modern influence works, not through crude orders, but through aligned incentives that create self-enforcing systems. And once those systems are in place, they don't need masterminds to keep running. They just need everyone involved to understand which path leads to favor and which leads to difficulty. And that brings us to the new age of manufactured reality. Over the last several years, we've watched a pattern repeat itself so many times that it should be obvious by now, but somehow it still catches people off guard. A story breaks. Anonymous sources, shocking allegations. The news cycle explodes with coverage. Everyone talks about it for days or weeks. Then quietly, the story falls apart. The allegations were exaggerated or completely false. The sources were politically motivated. The whole thing was manufactured to create a specific impression at a specific moment in time. But here's the thing. By the time the correction comes out, the damage is often done. The impression has been created. Most people never see the retraction. They only remember the initial shock and outrage. And that often was the whole point. You saw this pattern with certain allegations that dominated years of news coverage only to be revealed as unfounded. You saw it with stories dismissed as foreign interference only to be confirmed as authentic later. You saw it with claims about certain public figures that turned out to be completely fabricated but served their purpose during election seasons. These moments aren't random. They're part of a rhythm, a pattern designed to keep you in a constant state of emotional reaction, never quite able to step back and see the bigger picture. Because there's always a new crisis, a new outrage, a new reason to be afraid or angry. And here's what makes this so effective. Repetition makes fiction feel factual over time. If you hear something enough times from enough different sources, your brain starts to accept it as true, even if you never saw actual evidence. Psychologists call this the illusory truth effect. Propagandists have known about it for generations. So when you see 5 different outlets running nearly identical stories based on the same anonymous sources, all using the same framing and the same emotional language, that's not necessarily independent journalism confirming the fact. That can often be coordinated narrative construction. They're not just reporting a story, they're creating a perception. And once you understand this, you start to see it everywhere. You start to notice how stories that challenge certain interests get buried, while stories that support those interests get amplified. You start to notice the timing of leaks and revelations. You start to see the machinery behind the curtain. But seeing the machinery doesn't stop it from working. Because by this point, we've moved past simple manipulation into something more troubling. The normalization of political contention. Think about what's happened over just the past handful of years. Impeachment used to be a rare constitutional remedy reserved for genuine threats to the republic. Now it's a partisan weapon deployed multiple times against the same person for actions that previous generations would have handled through normal political processes. Raiding the home of a former president was unthinkable for our entire history. It violated an unspoken understanding that once you left office, even bitter political rivals respected certain boundaries. That line has been crossed. Attempting to remove candidates from ballots through legal maneuvering in over 20 states was something we associated with authoritarian regimes, not American democracy. That happened. Using the financial system as a weapon, pressuring banks to close accounts and deny services based on political views was the kind of thing we condemned when other countries did it. We're seeing it happen now. Every one of these actions required crossing a line that was previously considered sacred. Privacy, due process, political restraint, the peaceful transfer of power. One by one, these norms have been challenged. And each time, the justification is the same. This person is such a unique threat that normal rules don't apply. But here's what you need to understand. This isn't actually about one person. It never was. It's about establishing precedents. It's about normalizing punishment as politics. Because once these tactics become acceptable, once these lines have been crossed, they don't easily get uncrossed. They become part of the permanent toolkit. And when power stops trying to persuade and starts trying to intimidate, when it stops competing in the marketplace of ideas and starts trying to eliminate competition entirely, you're watching the very fabric of healthy democracy begin to fray. Now you might be thinking, surely people can see this happening. Surely the public won't stand for it. And you'd be right to think that, because in fact people are seeing it. They're concerned about it. But here's where we run into the next phase of this problem: how that concern gets channeled. Distrust of institutions doesn't automatically lead to better institutions. Sometimes it leads to radicalization. Sometimes it leads people to give up on the system entirely. Sometimes it pushes people toward extreme positions because the middle ground feels like complicity with corruption. We're watching this happen in real time. Both sides now sometimes see contention, at least verbal, if not physical, as increasingly necessary. Both sides sometimes believe the other represents an existential threat. Both sides have convinced themselves that normal democratic processes can't be trusted because the system is too flawed. And the tragic thing is, they're not entirely wrong. The system has its flaws, but the response to those flaws can sometimes make things worse rather than better. When reason leaves the conversation and gets replaced by pure emotion, by rage and fear, you don't always get reform. You often get more chaos. And underneath all that rage and fear is something even more corrosive: confusion. This brings us to perhaps the most powerful tool in the entire system: the digital revolution, and how it's sometimes been weaponized to rewrite truth in real time. Think about how information worked when you were younger. If you wanted to know what someone said, you might read the newspaper the next day. You might watch the evening news. You'd get the full context of a statement, the circumstances around it, the complete picture. Sure, there was bias even then, but there were also constraints. Space was limited, time was limited. Reporters had to make judgments about what truly mattered. But now, a 10-second clip can be extracted from an hour-long conversation. The context disappears. The clip gets shared a million times. Each share adds a new interpretation, a new framing, a new emotional overlay. Within hours, that 10 seconds can become the perceived truth of what happened, even if the full conversation meant something completely different. And it works in reverse too. Inconvenient video evidence can simply vanish, deleted from platforms, scrubbed from search results, made effectively invisible, even though it still technically exists somewhere. If people can't find it, if it doesn't appear in their feeds, does it really exist anymore? This is the digital illusion, the idea that whoever controls context controls reality. And context online is controlled by algorithms, by platform moderators, by coordinated reporting campaigns that can make something trend or make it disappear, often based on calculations beyond simple importance. You've probably experienced this yourself. You remember seeing something, you know you saw it, but when you try to find it again later, it's gone. Not deleted exactly, just buried under so many layers of other content that it might as well not exist. Or you see a headline that triggers a strong emotional reaction. You feel outraged or afraid or vindicated. But if you actually click through and read the full article, you discover the headline was misleading. The story doesn't quite support the impression the headline created. But how many people actually click through? Most people just read the headline, react emotionally, and move on. The platforms know this. The people crafting these headlines know this. It's not an accident, it's strategy. And the most sophisticated version of this isn't even about individual stories. It's about the cumulative effect of what you're shown and what you're not shown. Your feed becomes a curated reality, showing you a version of the world that reinforces certain beliefs while subtly hiding information that might challenge them. But here's what makes this especially insidious. It doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like you're seeing the truth. It feels like you're well-informed because you're consuming so much information. You don't realize that the information itself has been filtered, selected, arranged to create a specific worldview. And this brings us to the hidden truth that ties everything together. The thread Joel Osteen has been following from the beginning. The system isn't simply broken. That's what I need you to understand. When you look at all this chaos, all this dysfunction, all this apparent madness, your first instinct is probably to think something has gone terribly wrong, that our institutions have failed, that the system is collapsing. But what if it's not? What if the system is working exactly as it's been designed to work by human hands? What if all this chaos, all this outrage, all this division serves a purpose? What if the noise itself is the point? Think about it. When you're overwhelmed by contradictory information, when you're exhausted by constant outrage, when you can't tell what's real anymore because everything feels manipulated, what do most people do? They shut down. They stop paying attention. They retreat into familiar bubbles where at least the story is consistent. They give up on trying to understand the truth and settle for whatever narrative feels most comfortable. And that's exactly when you become most susceptible to influence. Not when you're ignorant, but when you're confused. Not when you have no information, but when you have too much contradictory information to sort through. Not when you trust nothing, but when you can't tell what deserves trust. The loudest noise, the biggest scandals, the most dramatic controversies, they all serve the same function: distraction. While everyone argues about the latest outrage, while everyone picks sides in the latest manufactured controversy, who benefits? Who's making decisions behind the scenes while you're focused elsewhere? Whose influence grows while you're too exhausted to notice? That's the real shift happening right now, and most people are missing it. Control no longer comes primarily from armies or even elections. It comes from narratives, from the ability to shape what people believe is true, what they think is important, what they fear, what they hope for. The same tools that were supposed to democratize information, that were supposed to give everyone a voice, are sometimes being used to shape consensus more effectively than any propaganda system in history. Because it doesn't feel like propaganda. It feels like your own thoughts, your own discoveries, your own conclusions. But awareness, my friends, breaks the spell. When you start to question not just what you're told, but why you're being told it. When you start to notice patterns instead of just reacting to individual events. When you step back and look at who benefits from your confusion, the illusion starts to collapse. You start to see that most of the things you're told to be outraged about are often designed to keep you outraged, not truly to inform you. You start to see that some of the people claiming to defend democracy are sometimes the very ones undermining its spirit most effectively. You start to see that the real division isn't just between left and right, but between those who benefit from the current system and those who are being challenged by it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the real power of awareness. Not that it solves every problem, but that it lets you stop being manipulated by manufactured narratives. It lets you focus on what actually matters in your life, instead of what you're told should matter. The truth is simple. When you strip away all the noise, you're most likely being influenced. We're all being influenced. The game is often structured, but not always in the way most people think. It's not rigged to favor one party or another, ultimately. It's often structured to favor those who control the narrative itself, regardless of their official political label. And the antidote isn't anger. Anger is just another form of control, another way to keep you reacting emotionally instead of thinking clearly. The antidote is recognition, awareness, discernment, asking questions that don't have comfortable answers, and seeking truth with an open heart. That's the real revolution. Not rebellion against the system, but recognition of how the system actually works. Because once enough people see it, once enough people start questioning instead of blindly accepting, once enough people refuse to play along with manufactured outrage and deliberate confusion, the whole structure starts to lose its power over your peace. You don't need to overthrow anything. You just need to stop believing the narratives. Stop accepting them at face value. Stop letting others define reality for you. Now, if you found this perspective eye-opening, if something here made you see things a little differently, do me a favor and hit that like button. It actually matters because it helps this message reach more people who need to hear it. The algorithms I've been talking about work both ways. If enough people engage with content that encourages thoughtful questioning, it becomes harder to suppress. Subscribe to our channel if you believe truth should never be filtered through political convenience or institutional power. If you believe ordinary people deserve to see reality as it actually is, not as someone wants them to see it. And here's what Joel Osteen really wants to know. Tell me in the comments what moment made you realize something didn't add up. Was there a specific event, a specific story, a specific contradiction that made you start questioning what you were being told? Because those moments of recognition are powerful, and sharing them helps other people have their own moments of clarity. The more we start asking questions, the more we compare notes, the more we refuse to accept easy answers to complicated questions, the more the hidden truth loses its grip. Not because we have all the answers, but because we stop pretending that those in power do. This isn't about cynicism. It's about clarity. It's about refusing to be treated like children who need to be protected from uncomfortable truths. It's about taking back the responsibility to think for yourself, to evaluate information critically, to trust your own judgment instead of outsourcing it to experts who may not always have your highest good at heart. That's the hidden truth they don't want you to see. You're smarter than they think you are. You're more capable of handling complexity than they give you credit for. And you're more powerful than they want you to believe. Because the moment you stop accepting their narratives is the moment their control over your peace and perspective truly ends. So keep questioning, keep thinking, keep refusing to be manipulated by outrage and fear. Because that's how this changes. Not through dramatic revolution, but through millions of individual people simply deciding to see clearly instead of seeing through someone else's lens. The truth has been hidden in plain sight all along. Now you've seen it. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. God bless you.